Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about careers in usability and user experience or UX design. But before we get into exactly what that is, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Amy Hogan. I did my PhD in psychology from the University of Bath, and my thesis focused on the intersection between cognitive processes, user experience, and user interface design. And my research interests include new media psychology, so that's anything to do with social media or the impact that the internet is having on our lives. I, of course, look into usability and user experience, and a bunch of other fun stuff such as gamification and game-based learning, as well as digital pedagogies and flipped learning. So the reason I wanted to give you this brief overview into usability and user experience is that this career path might not be one that immediately comes to mind when you're studying psychology. However, as I'll hope you'll see, psychology is very, very relevant, and graduate psychologists possess many helpful skills for a career in this area. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on the concept of usability. So hopefully the first question that comes to mind is, well, what is usability? So simply put, usability relates to how easy something is to use. It refers to how quickly people can learn to use something, how memorable it is, how error-free or error-prone it is, and generally how much users like using it. So let me give you an everyday example. How many of you have had this experience, pushing on a door when you actually needed to pull, or vice versa? Most of the time, we use doors without thinking about it, and it's only when we come across these doors where we have a problem with the design that it becomes apparent. So as you can see here by this quote, good design goes to heaven, bad design goes everywhere. So those doors that don't work actually have a term for it. They're called a Norman door. And a Norman door is basically a poorly designed door that confuses or fails to give you an idea of whether to push or pull. So the fault is not with ourselves, but in the design that ignores the needs and the psychology of users, of people. These so-called Norman doors are actually named after Don Norman, who is a cognitive psychologist and usability engineer, and he wrote this very famous book called The Design of Everyday Things, in which he explores these Norman doors and other usability fails in the everyday world. Ironically, it's often easier to know when something isn't usable than when it is. So great design is when you don't even notice the design, when you interact with something seamlessly and there's no fault. They only become really, really obvious when the usability of an object or a service or a product fails. And that's where we're going to go next. And when you start to look around and notice, you'll realize that bad design is everywhere. So I'm going to give you a few, hopefully, funny examples. On the screen, you'll see some examples of unfortunate graphic design. Font and spacing are key here. How about this t-shirt telling you not to be happy and to worry? Or this really unfortunate choice for carpeting on stairs? And there are so many examples out there for bad physical space designing, particularly in bathrooms. We can all appreciate this one, trying to wrangle with remote controls that have way too many buttons. Or have you ever tried to spend hours changing the clock on either your oven or your car when the clocks go forwards and backwards? It shouldn't be this complicated. How about this for a website? This is an actual website that exists. There is so much information that's going on and your eyes just don't know where to rest. And so it's really difficult to understand exactly what you need to do or where you need to go to find the information that you need on this website. And here's one last example of some parking signs. There are so many bits of information going on, it's really difficult to know exactly when or where you are allowed or not allowed to park. So someone took these signs and redesigned them to make them much more usable. So this one sign now very clearly outlines the days and the times that you are and are not allowed to park. So much simpler, so much more usable. Okay, so now I've given you quite a few examples of some bad usability design. So now let's examine, well, why does this matter? There are some significant real-life impacts for bad design that go beyond just poor font choice. For example, the Airbus 320 crash back in January 1992 was caused by a switch in the wrong position. This changed the meaning and interpretation of the data, which is key for pilots in order to safely fly the plane. So a switch being in a wrong position actually led to fatal disaster. Another disaster caused by a usability error was with the London Ambulance Service. Their dispatch system, their interface, scrolled incoming calls off the screen before they had been dealt with, and there was no way to get them back. So interface design here again was key to some very significant impact for life. Another example was the Therac 25 radiotherapy machine, which killed a number of patients due to unclear error messages. They had a very vague message like malfunction 1 or malfunction 64, which placed patients at risk because the operator had no idea what the meaning of the error was, and it wasn't described in the operator's manual. So we start to see that there are some serious implications for these usability errors. And in order to do our best to avoid them, users should be an integral part of the design process. And this is when psychology really comes into play. The user-centered approach focuses on people at every stage of the design process. So from doing beginning research to understanding who is your user base and what they want to do with your product and your service. And then you might develop some cases and you go back to the user to see how they are using the products. Then you develop prototypes and you go back and you ask them to evaluate the design or the product or the service. And so you have this kind of cyclical process where the user is at the center of the design. So when designing products, services, or interfaces, we often refer to the power user. And that can be defined in a variety of ways. You could potentially be talking about the most active set of users or the most experienced users. It might even be the most enthusiastic or the early adopters, or it could be an expert user. But it's up to the researcher, the psychologist, to help define who the power user is. And with that, we have to understand their psychology. We have to understand their motivations, their thoughts, feelings, their perceptions, their experience, their efficacy, or their belief in their own skill set, because all of these factors have an impact on how someone might interact with a particular design or interface. So psychology is absolutely integral to a user-centered design process. And taking such a human-centered approach to product design and usability fuels the creation of products that resonate much more deeply with an audience. A further implication is that by researching our user base, we can create products and services with universal design, that is, making sure that all users have equal access to information and functionality. And making designs accessible is so important. Accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent the interaction with or the access to websites, interfaces, spaces, and places by people with different abilities. So hopefully that's given you an idea of what usability is, and more importantly, why it matters. And maybe now you might consider user interface design or user experience or usability testing as a future career path. You might consider becoming a UX researcher. So often students from the social sciences, so psychology or humanities, have great skills that are relevant to this career. For example, conducting usability tests and interviews and surveys and field studies and doing research into your user base, all key skills that you have learned as a psychologist. Another potential job is becoming a UX designer, which has a slightly more visual design background, but nonetheless, some of the skills as a psychologist that we've talked about before are just as important. You still have to do data analysis, research, designing products, and so you're having to understand your user base. At the end of the day, there are so many avenues that you can use to get into this type of career path, and psychology is just one of them. So that wraps up my presentation on careers in usability and user experience design. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact details on the screen. And thanks so much for watching, and I really hope it's been useful.